This is Talk is Sheep, the official podcast of the Wild Sheep Society of BC, brought to you by Sitka Gear. Come along as we bring conversations that matter to you into the high alpine. This episode is sponsored by our conservation partner, Gunworks. Thank you, Sitka Gear and Gunworks, for investing in healthy wildlife and sustainable ecosystems. Well, good morning, Morgan. Good morning, Landon. I guess you guys are coming to us from the north central part of the province. Welcome to Talk is Sheep, and great to have you both on this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Awesome. So, guys, what we're going to do is we'll do a little bit of an intro to give our guests an overview, and then we're going to get into a lot of the conservation work that's being done in Region 7A. A lot of great work being done on the ground there. And Morgan, I know a lot of our listeners will know who you are. You've been quite involved with the horn aging and stuff and in the wild sheep community. So you're no stranger to a lot of our listeners. But with that said, let's start off with you, Landon, a little bit about who you are, where you're at, and kind of what you're working on right now.
Yeah, you bet. So right now I'm a wildlife biologist here in Prince George and current master's candidate at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan in the Wildlife Restoration Ecology Lab under Adam Ford. And so, a little bit about me. I'm actually BC born, but East Coast raised. So I've actually spent most of my life in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI. Kind of was interested in wildlife and, fostered through my dad and taught me how to hunt and fish and things like that and the value of it. And, that stayed with me right up in the university where I started pursuing a degree in wildlife and fisheries at the University of New Brunswick, at least initially. And sort of during my time there, my first year, we were kind of always told to get out and get some more experience, learn some field skills, because a lot of people tend to go through their degrees without getting some of those. And a unique way I thought to gain some of that experience and have a pretty cool job was to try my hand at being a horseback hunting guide in BC. And so, I applied to a few outfits in British Columbia looking for wranglers. And luckily enough, I was hired by an outfit based in Prince George that was owned by two wildlife biologists. And so that kind of taught me a lot about, the wildlife in BC and the conservation challenges they faced from sort of this bottom up perspective of, a resource user who's making, single point observations about behavior and movements of animals. And, the influence that they had on me led me to finish my wildlife degree at the University of Northern British Columbia. And following that, I was hired by a wildlife consulting company based in Mackenzie, and they worked on a variety of wildlife research and conservation projects. Got a lot of experience there working on stone sheep and caribou recovery. Specific projects were like the Dunleavy and Schooler Stone Sheep Health Project, which we partnered with the Wild Sheep Society on, and some caribou recovery projects in the Cleanziza. And kind of working through that, I eventually wanted to complete my master's, so I started to get involved with this project we're going to talk about, and that's how I ended up at the UBCO.
Okay, so on that note, talk about what your specific field of, so you're doing your master's degree right now. Can you talk a little bit about UMBC, the involvement of Dr. Ford, and how you got involved in that project? And I think there's the MyTax component as well. Can you touch on that a little bit as well while we're at it, Landon?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, so I guess kind of how it all started for me, I guess kind of was back in 2017. In my summers, you're encouraged to go get field experience in your summers away from school. And I started working with Krista Sittler on her prescribed burn assessments in 2017. And, that was kind of a nutrition based project. And, kind of working with her, I really kind of started to get this influence of how nutrition is so foundational to understanding how different wildlife populations and their dynamics, how it impacts survival, reproduction, growth, and, it kind of really made me interested in the nutrition component of wildlife management. And so I worked on a variety of different projects after that. I went to Ontario to work with caribou and foraging, and then I went down to Wyoming to work on bighorn sheep down there on a nutrition project. And that's sort of where my interest in animal nutrition started. And my involvement on this project actually was initially started in 2020 by Morgan, actually. When I was freshly graduated, she needed somebody who could be an observer in a helicopter to survey the Finley Russell Range that wouldn't puke and had decent game eyes. It You'd think it'd be easy, but spinning around in circles in a helicopter looking at a window for 8 hours when it can be pretty cold tends to make people a lot of fairly nauseous. And then being able to spot game decently well, like a stone sheep hiding under a rock in a big rocky area, can be pretty difficult. And so she recruited me on that survey in our now study area back in 2020. And kind of from that survey, we observed an apparent 50% decline in the population since it was last surveyed in 1993, and that kind of sparked the initial monitoring of this population. And from discussions with a fairly large stakeholder base on that initial project, we found other knowledge gaps in the area, particularly around like nutrition and habitat enhancement, and we wanted to figure out ways to address that. And so it kind of evolved, with my interest in nutrition and the knowledge gaps around that, into the project or projects it is now, which is population monitoring and some of this nutrition work that I'm doing my master's on. And
okay, keep going.
Sorry. Yeah. So, I all through my time working in Mackenzie, I really did want to complete a master's, just to get that edge, and be at a higher potential in my career. And I've always been waiting for sort of the right project and the right advisor to come around. And I had been offered a few master's projects in the past, and it just for whatever reason things didn't always seem like a great fit for me. And this project seemed to fit really well because it was one that I sort of developed with help from Morgan, of course, and I was really invested in. And you work harder on things that you're invested in directly and in an area you work in. So the project seemed like a good fit. And then through a lot of discussions with Adam and some of his other students, his view on things and his approach and methodology really seemed to mesh really well with mine. And working in with some of the other students in the wire lab, it seemed like a really good fit. And they're a pretty supportive lab. They're really encouraging of getting people out there and helping develop their skill set. And it's been really great working with him. And that lab has a lot of ties that really help support their students through things like MyTax, and he's helped a lot with getting these sponsorships to support his students through organizations like the BC Wildlife Federation and the Abbotsford Fish and Game Club that really stepped up to help support me in my position and get this research out the door and really help stone sheep in the province.
Awesome. Talk a little bit. So you talked about doing your master's through UNBC, but Dr. Ford is at UBC Okanagan. So as a master's student, do you pick the lab that you're working with and the prof? I would have, in my brain, I would have thought UNBC would have been where you've been working through, but what's the connection or disconnect there in my brain?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I did my undergrad at UNBC, and then I'm doing my graduate degree at UBC.
Okay, cool.
There was, it would make sense that, my projects in the north, I'd be out of UNBC, but, there is some advantages to switching where you get your undergraduate and graduate degrees. And, Adam seemed like a really knowledgeable prof to learn from and, diversify a little bit. So that's kind of why I opted to go to UBCO. Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Dr. Ford's phenomenal. He's done a ton of work for tons of species, but certainly wild sheep. So that makes a lot of sense for sure. Okay, good. I have more questions for you, but we're going to segue over to Morgan. So Morgan Anderson, biologist in Region 7A, which is like the north central part of the province, Prince George North-ish. Can you tell us a little bit, Morgan, about who you are, where you came from, and let's start kind of the early days for you, Morgan, like where you got your early interest in sort of that field, and then how you ended up with the government, and a little bit of the background there, please.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm one of several of our provincial biologists who came from Nelson, BC originally, and then went through University of Northern BC for our undergrads. I think there's like 4 or 5 of us who then ended up as like regional biologists working for the province. And I don't know what it is about Nelson that kind of spurs that off. Definitely there's a pretty sizable population of like wildlife biologists that are based there. So it's, and obviously a ton of both consumptive and non-consumptive recreation values, a lot of sort of outdoor opportunities. So I actually grew up on a small farm and sort of a working woodlot. So it was pretty outdoors most of the time growing up. And so wildlife biology was a pretty natural kind of fit. And so I ended up pursuing that for my undergrad at UNBC, and then kind of hopped around for a few years doing field technician work on sort of shorter contracts, kind of all over North America. And that was probably one of my favorite projects that I was working on for that, was actually working with bighorn sheep and looking at a small population in Montana on the National Bison Range, where it's a really unique population because it's quite isolated. It's actually fenced in, and they've done transplants in there. So they actually know sort of the inbreeding and outbreeding amounts in all of the individual sheep, and have tracked them through survival and reproduction and dominance status for essentially generations. And it's a really interesting situation to be able to observe sheep behavior and the individual kind of traits that lead to different sort of dominance and different mating tactics, and how those can have these huge fitness repercussions like generations later. And it was a really interesting project. And then we extended it to sort of a wilder kind of environment up in Kananaskis based out of Blue River, looking at kind of the spatial implications of these dominance hierarchies, where you'll have kind of dominant rams that can control ewes in one area, but then you also have a bunch of these really large rams that are not the dominant, but if they leave and go and check out sheep groups in the neighboring areas, they can be a local dominant there. And so getting to be basically based alone in a wall tent for 6 weeks in November, December in Kananaskis with like a dodgy Globalstar sat phone and no one planning to check up on you was actually a really fun experience. Little bit jarring coming back around Christmas time to civilization, but you get over it. And so that was just like a really fun project. I went back a couple of times on that one. And then eventually kind of hit the same point where Landon's kind of saying you get to a point where you get a lot of this experience, but grad school starts to look a little bit better, because getting the opportunity to actually ask your own questions and shape your own project, and then run through the analysis and the results and formulate that into something that can be used as management recommendations is it's a really critical part of being an effective biologist. And it's something that we often don't get exposed to in sort of technician roles. So I ended up going back to do my master's work with John Fryxell and Brent Patterson at University of Guelph in Ontario. I lasted about one semester in Guelph proper and realized there were too many people in Southern Ontario. But luckily, the project I'd signed on to was looking at sort of wolf, moose, caribou interactions across all of boreal Ontario. So we were actually monitoring something like more than 40 wolf packs over like 3 study areas, each of which was like 2 to 3 times the size of Yellowstone. Like it was a massive project with a bunch of, I think we had about 30 different partners in the Ministry of Natural Resources, Canadian Forest Service, Trent University, Guelph University. Really cool project, a lot of very applied field skills. And so then I was able to kind of take that and did a short stint with the BC, with the provincial government in Fort St. John. They didn't let me go outside enough. So then I jumped from there up to government in Nunavut and was the regional biologist for the high Arctic for 4 years. Really enjoyed my time up there. Was working a lot with the communities of Resolute and Grise Fiord and training people up and learning a lot from folks about how to find your way home from the flow edge on a snowmobile when it decides to be a whiteout, and that kind of, fun, applicable life skills, I suppose. and then ended up coming back down to Prince George to take a wildlife biologist position here. Although I did, for the next 3 years, jump back up to Nunavut to wrap up a few projects with the folks that I'd been working with up there on my vacations. So I've been in PG with the team here since like October 2016, and then just bounced up last year, I guess, to the senior biologist position because, I don't know, somebody had to do it, I guess.
Does that mean less time in the field for you as a senior biologist?
Oh, hell no. I wouldn't have taken it if that was the case.
Yeah, fair. Just curious, with the work that you did in Nunavut, what kind of animals, like what species were you managing up there? Like, obviously, you're the bio, so you're managing, I guess, everything. But what sort of what were you doing? Doll sheep projects? What kind of projects were you looking at?
Yeah, so I was actually up in kind of that very top tier of those islands up at the very far north. So there's actually not a ton of diversity up there. It was mostly, we were doing a lot of work with Peary caribou, which are sort of a smaller, lighter subspecies that they'd been kind of assessed as endangered and then reassessed kind of as threatened. And so we were working on kind of pulling together the federal recovery strategy and then territorial management plans with a lot of the input from the communities. Because, I mean, a lot of the information that's available for caribou, muskox, wolves, bears, a lot of things up there is held by local communities. And it's essentially the traditional knowledge up there is Inuit Kaujimajatuqangit, which I cannot pronounce because my Inuktitut is absolutely bafflingly terrible. Despite 4 years in Igloolik where it's spoken a fair bit. But so using a lot of those other kind of knowledge sources to fill in the gaps and develop kind of the best practices for species recovery. So we did a bunch of Peary caribou work. We were also we did a bunch of landscape genetics, looking at kind of how different populations were related and what sort of historically was influencing the movements between different areas in the high Arctic, which was a really interesting project because it was taking into account that the communities didn't really like the idea of capture and collaring for caribou specifically. It was sort of seen as something where it wasn't good for sort of either the well-being of the animal or kind of like a more spiritual side of it. And so we looked at alternative ways to get at the same kind of questions, and non-invasive genetic sampling from like fecal pellets was one that we could actually use. And so we had a bunch of crews. We'd go out and just hike literally hundreds of kilometers across the tundra in a bunch of different areas, collecting samples. And then we were also interested in kind of the influence of predators on caribou. And while the communities weren't supportive of collaring the caribou themselves, they didn't have the same concerns about wolves. So we actually got 10 collars out on wolves up in the high Arctic, and we're looking at a lot of the sort of space use and movement and predation patterns for Arctic wolves, and kind of looking at the system. It seems to be kind of similar to our caribou wolf moose system down here, but with muskox up there. So really interesting kind of working through that, looking at a lot of baseline disease and health determinants in things like muskox that are often pretty susceptible to a lot of diseases, kind of like a lot of the sheep and goats that get hammered by sort of these disease outbreaks. And with a lot of the sort of changing climate parameters, there's been sort of a bunch of weird outbreaks and changing like parasite dynamics, especially in the Western Arctic. So we were just trying to get some baseline stuff there. And of course, you can't be up there that long and not get dragged into the polar bear world a little bit. So I was doing a bunch of the Gulf of Boothia polar bear population estimates. So it's a genetic mark recapture. You basically go and dart them with a little biopsy dart, pick up your little sample and fly on to the next bear and dart that one. And it's a way less invasive way of doing it than actually having to knock the bears out. And it can be pretty effective and pretty low stress for the bears. Sometimes you'd be trying to haze them away from where the dart had bounced out, and they just did not feel like moving. So yeah, it was a really, really great opportunity and great to be working with the folks up there.
Very cool. Okay, there's one thing that I got two things to say. First of all, yeah, I can't believe I said Dull sheep when I mentioned Nunavut. I actually meant to say muskox. So just to be clear, that was my geographics or my Dull sheep locations are not very sound there. So my apologies. Thanks for clarifying all that. And I meant to ask muskox, not Dull sheep. So very cool. And then part two is I know for sure we should have had each of you on individually because there's so much stuff here I want to talk about. But that said, I'm going to forge on and talk about our stone sheep project in 7A. And so, Landon, you talked about the two parts. You talked about the population monitoring aspect, and you talked about the nutrition aspect. So, Landon, if you could maybe give us an overview of what you're doing in your MyTax or in your role through your masters and the project that the society is involved in. Talk a little bit about that, and then Morgan, if you can fill in the gaps around the government aspect of it, why this project's important. But we'll start off with Landon a little bit about talking about the project itself.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, it sparked all off from that survey in 2020, where we seen a marked decline of about 50% from the previous two surveys. So the previous survey was in 93 and the one before that was 1985. And we'd seen about a decline of about half since then. And so we were a little bit alarmed, wondering, what really happened here? Is this a true population decline, or in that time frame, have these sheep shifted their range somewhere else in response to something? So, we didn't want to say this was a true decline yet, because we knew almost nothing apart from these three surveys about the sheep in the area. And so, following some discussions with a pretty significant stakeholder base, involving a lot of different organizations, and some help from the Wild Sheep Society of BC, who helped us purchase collars for the first year, we together, the company I worked for at the time, Wildlife Infometrics, and the ministry, Morgan, we started to put these collars on to monitor range use and survival and reproduction and health, to see if there was anything really going on here and to fill in that information gap. And some of those conversations kind of, evolved, as I said before, to conversations about habitat enhancement and how we can address some of the knowledge gaps around what role nutrition plays with our wild sheep. A lot of our fellow researchers and managers in the U.S. have, identified that, nutrition is really foundational in how these animals can survive and reproduce. And, they've had these thresholds at which, for certain species, survival is compromised or pregnancy is compromised, but nobody's done that on stone sheep specifically. And, BC is kind of unique in that we're the only ones that really have stone sheep. And so it was kind of another factor that we wanted to try to look into while we had collars out, because we could look at the nutritional condition of the animals while we're also looking at survival and pregnancy. And so I think we started the nutrition component in 24 last year, where we would try to get out and look at how fat these animals are, because that nutritional condition, or how fat they are, does really impact their survival. And so we measure that condition as fat, and it's a really good metric that we can measure fat. It gives us an idea of how healthy they are, and how fat works in a lot of these ungulates in sort of this northern hemisphere is, in the summer, fall, that's sort of when they're at their peak of fat levels. That's when the highest level they usually get to, because they just ate really good, nutritious, highly available forage all, summer, fall. And so they reach this peak. And then as soon as winter onsets, the availability, the quality, and the quantity of forage isn't really there. And so their condition generally declines until about a low of about spring. That's when spring is when, the melt happens and we get fresh green growth. And kind of how we're approaching this is that, there's this theory that animals condition in the fall. Sorry, I got to restart that. Historically, we see animals sort of declining and in very poor condition in winter. And we think that is a direct result of that winter range condition. We see them really starving, really poor condition. They're dying a lot. And so that's our immediate knee-jerk reaction, is to hey, we need to fix winter range. There's something wrong. They're all dying on winter range. But sort of this new line of thinking that's, being developed is that, that is just a result of their condition from the summer, fall. That's sort of that peak that they were at. It's in the wintertime, a sheep is generally not eating a lot, and what is there, like I said, isn't really the best for them. And then a lot of times, even if there is really high quality forage there relatively, it can be unavailable because it's under snow or something like that. Especially for stone sheep where we are, it's pretty rugged terrain. It's in a bit of a snow belt. It's hard to have good access to forage in the winter for them. And so we wanted to try and figure this out. Is actually late summer and early fall more critical to their overwinter condition than their actual winter range? So that's very confusing, but is that peak in fall condition, does that influence their late winter condition more because they had better access to summer, fall, high quality forage than they did in the winter? It's a really hard idea to think about without some visuals, but that's kind of the idea of what we're trying to get at with the nutrition component.
No, it makes a lot of sense, right? And then there's the climate change factor too, right? Like these different factors, and is that affecting summer forage as well, right? Are these environmental factors in the wintertime? Does that have any impact? Obviously, early days, but that's going to be one of the outcomes of your master's study. Is that correct? Is your findings from this?
Yeah. We're trying to really figure out which season is the most influential on late winter fat, because that late winter is when we see them dying, and that's dying because the results of poor fat reserves built up. It's like a thing I like to say is it's survival of the fattest. The fatter sheep generally has better odds of surviving, and the lowest. At the lowest time of the year, generally late winter, spring, if we can bump that fat level up, they stand a better chance. But we're trying to figure out first if it's summer fall range, if that better quality summer fall range makes them fatter over late winter, or if it's better quality early winter, late winter range that makes them fatter at that time. So that's the real question we're trying to answer. And yeah, like you say, it's really important thinking about climate change as well, because generally speaking, climate change is actually reducing a little bit of quality and diversity of forage. And it's actually making relatively harsher winters for sheep. For you and I, it's going to be a little bit warmer for us down at low elevation, but for sheep up high, what that generally means is they're getting more ice on snow events. They're getting a lot more melt and freeze, and that builds up a really thick crust on top of the snow. And generally speaking, sheep don't want to walk through that. It's really energetically demanding to walk through that. They don't want to paw through it. As little as 30 centimeters of snow, let alone a crust, will prevent a sheep from wanting to forage for anything. And that gives kind of all the benefits to the predators. Something like a wolverine that can walk on a crusty snow a lot easier than a sheep that'll pencil right through that. So, if we can boost their fat reserves as high as possible, even before they get into winter, we give them a much better chance regardless of what happens over winter. There's, of course, we can't control for everything, but, from an animal perspective, boosting fat, we're going to give them a pretty good chance.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. So Dr. Kevin Monteith at the Monteith shop, I think he's out of South Dakota. He's done a bunch of work on, the nutrition and health of the ewe when it comes to lambing. Has significant factors, and he did a bunch of work on that years ago. I remember seeing one of his studies 4 or 5 years ago that I think was funded by the Wild Sheep Foundation, Alberta. So are you looking exclusively at mature animals, ewes and rams? Or are you looking at lamb recruitment and what that's doing and their ability to survive the winter as well? Is that a factor in the study? And if so, are you using, I guess, what other studies are you using to sort of support your study moving forward?
Yeah, actually, my time in Wyoming was working in the Monteith shop as a technician for a couple of his students, Brittany Wagler and Rachel Smiley, who worked on bighorns in that area. And so, yeah, it's kind of evolved with Kevin's idea, and actually a couple of other nutritional ecologists, Rachel Cook and John Cook, who work pretty extensively on elk and caribou, developing these relationships between fat and survival and reproduction and offspring survival and things like that. And so, yeah, we're trying to really leverage a lot of what they have found in other species onto stone sheep. And of course, another really big paper from Tom Stevenson establishing these with bighorn sheep in California and other areas in the States. And I think our thresholds are going to be much different for stone sheep than what they have found for bighorns. I think right around 20% body fat and ingesta-free body fat. They find that survival probability is below, I think, 90%. And, very preliminary data in our case, but we're sort of around 13%. Stone sheep probably live in a bit harsher terrain. They get a lot of deep snow. It's really rugged terrain, a little bit different than what they see in California. So, they might be a little more adapted to lower levels than what we see in bighorns. But yeah, we're sort of leveraging off of what they have learned on bighorns and in other species like elk and caribou to try and figure out how these play out in our stone sheep. And for us, just for this initial first take, we're looking at just adult ewes for now. We'd love to take this further and try to implement, taking body fat measurements on all stone sheep captured in the province. That's something we're in discussions with the provincial vet, because that's some pretty valuable data to get if we can. But yeah, for now, we're starting with adult ewes, and yeah, we're assessing their fat at that given time and whether or not they were pregnant, if they had any other health concerns like a disease or an injury that could be influencing their survival or fat levels. And then in the following year, we're also assessing whether or not they had a lamb at heel. If that could be energetically draining, to keep a lamb alive all year. And then, yeah, we've been continuing that sort of every year to try and assess whether these relationships with fat are influenced by those things.
Awesome. Okay, Morgan, I'll get you to jump in here too. And Landon, you guys can tag team this however you feel applicable. But you mentioned these population declines, and you said in some cases it looked like they were down possibly up to 50% from a survey was done in the 90s. Can you guys talk a little bit about, is this a nutrition concern? I don't think it's habitat loss by the sounds of it, or maybe there's competition with other species. I know I've talked about this, Landon, with elk. I guess you guys have done the baseline work around disease, so that you probably ruled out disease. Talk a little bit about the historic numbers and maybe what your feeling is in terms of these population declines, why that's happening. If you could touch on that a little bit for us, Morgan, and Landon back up, what your thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, it's one of these things that we kind of run into when we only get kind of a couple of sort of point estimates in time that are super widely separated. So there was a survey flown in 1985, and then there was apparently a bit of a population increase by the 1993 survey. And then, like Landon mentions, when we flew it in 2020, we saw about half as many in 1993. But I mean, we're looking at kind of close to 30 years of who knows what was going on between then. Is the 1993 one kind of a bit of a bump? Is there a change in absolute abundance, or is it a distribution kind of issue? So one of the main things that we were kind of concerned with, like one of the just fundamental questions when we got those kind of survey results is, what are we even surveying? Are we surveying a contiguous herd area, or are we only looking at part of it? And when sheep are moving in and out of that survey area, we're not catching them. So one of the first things that we were kind of thinking was, we need to get some kind of sense of what the herd range is delineated as. Are we even monitoring something that's biologically relevant? And of course, from sort of the harvest management side, you want to know what those population boundaries are, because that's how we ostensibly are managing any of the harvest in the province for any big game, is by population units. And there are some cases in which we have that pretty well dialed, but once you get up into a lot of these more remote areas, we really just don't have a lot of that baseline information that's so fundamental to either the population management or any of the sort of habitat management options that are potentially available. And so that was one side of it. And then the other part that we really try and look at in these cases of declines, like kind of provincially, I know with the Provincial Moose Research Project, we're well into sort of 12 years or so of monitoring. And the idea behind that, which I'm also quite involved in, and so was kind of thinking in the same framework for some of the sheep stuff here, is it's not so much just the trend that we're seeing, but the mechanisms that are actually leading to that trend. Because it's all well and good to say, okay, we've seen a decline, but unless you know what's acting on that population to cause that decline, you can't really come up with an effective management strategy to address it. And so that's also where we kind of linked in with Landon's work, really focusing on the nutritional kind of side, because we can go out and we can monitor recruitment and survival and cause-specific mortality. But it was also an opportunity to be like, well, we can get more information on some of these potential limiting factors, like those bottom-up forage-based factors that would then inform kind of what are our potential next steps, what potential management levers could we pull that we might actually get some outcomes for sheep on the landscape. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's sort of a roundabout way of highlighting kind of our overall approach with the project, I think, and then kind of leveraging what knowledge sources we would need to inform the levers that are available to us.
Cool. Landon, do you want to jump in with anything? I've got a couple questions on that, but if there's anything you want to add before I go there, Landon, go right ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just to add just a tiny bit, like that area is really rugged. Like if you fly it, you'd think there's sheep here. Like it really just looks like goat range. It's pretty rugged. It's kind of in a snow belt along the Rocky Mountain Trench, and so it's kind of not terribly hard to believe some harsh winters could have led to this decline. Like the Yukon has documented a lot of thin horn die-offs associated with some harsh winters in that time frame, but kind of like what Morgan alluded to, there's so much that could have happened. It could have been multiple factors. But yeah, that's just seeing where they are. It's not terribly hard to believe some harsh winters could have knocked them back.
Okay, so just to clarify, you guys have got collars on those sheep. So if that's the case, you've got samples from them. So there's no evidence or expectation that there's been a disease event. Is that correct?
Nothing major like what we're seeing with sort of the Moby outbreaks or some of the like 1990s pneumonia die-offs and some of the bighorns. We also haven't heard anything like locally. A lot of the guys in Seke and Quadacha get up into that area. There's some active sheep hunters there. And in talking to folks, they don't remember sort of any major sort of the sheep were here one year and then the next year they were all sick and then they were dead. So we don't think that there's been any of those kind of outbreaks. And there's also they're quite remote as far as like distance to domestics goes. So it wouldn't be sort of something that we would innately expect. That being said, when we were doing some of the captures this winter and then in the Lammet Heel survey in June, we actually did have 2 of our sheep with contagious ecthyma, so ORF, which we haven't actually reported previously in stone sheep in BC. It is in mountain goats, and there's a few populations, especially in the Skeena, that have had it. We hadn't seen it in goats in 7A either, although this year I can think of at least 2 of the compulsory inspection goats that look like they may have had some of it. Not really sure where that's come from. ORF isn't one that causes these massive die-offs, but it's a little bit concerning when we don't know kind of where the transmission route was for that particular pathogen. It's basically a virus. They get kind of like cold sores around their mouths, ears, and eyes. So it can affect their ability to feed and detect predators and that kind of thing. But it's not one that immediately kills them. The sores will heal.
Okay, great. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit. One of the things that came up is there was the survey work, there was the declines, and then we've seen some management outcomes from that where there was a proposal to reduce the season or restrict the season or terminate the sheep hunting season in that area. And one of the things I've talked about with Landon is the confidence of the data. So, and you touched a little bit on it, Landon, but can you talk a little bit, and either one of you guys talk a little bit about on sheep numbers? So are you very confident on the numbers in that region? Obviously that quote hunting management unit's quite large. So is there a very high confidence on that data? Or I know the sheep weren't there where they were seen in the 80s and 90s, but is it quite possible that we don't fully understand the range and they maybe just weren't there that time of year? Can you just touch a little bit on that before we move forward?
I'll just jump in. There's we haven't had any reg change proposals or anything for Finley Russell to shut anything down. I think Dunleavy Schooler was having some population concerns. Yeah. But yeah, at present, we haven't had any proposed regulation changes for this study area. But okay. Yeah, that's exactly like you're saying. In order to have the kind of confidence in, are we actually surveying a population? Are we assessing our harvest at a population level? Those are the kinds of things that we would want to consider for any sort of changes to quota allocation, reg changes. And just as another highlight too, it is one of these things where for stone sheep, having that 8-year full curl restriction on harvest, like that is already a pretty conservative harvest limitation as far as like population outcomes, right? As long as we're not messing with our recruiting juveniles and we're not messing with our adult females, then we're generally looking at something where it's probably not going to be a licensed harvest issue driving the population if we're pulling out mature males.
So on that note, just out of curiosity, what was lamb recruitment like? Were there a lot of up and comers? Like the population numbers are down, but was there good lamb recruitment, or was that a concern as well?
It's been pretty decent. Yeah. Any of the recruitment metrics can be pretty variable year to year, but can correct me if I'm wrong, Landon. I think we've had kind of in that sort of 30-35-ish for lambs per 100 ewe-like sheep, I guess. It's usually you try and look at the recruitment metrics as like the number of young of the year to the number of adult females. With stone sheep, it's a little bit tricky because we'll have sort of yearling male and female and ewes and class 1 rams, those kind of little quarter curl or less guys that often we can't necessarily tell apart reliably from the helicopter. On some of our surveys, we've been pretty good and had some pretty solid high resolution photographs that we can tease it out. And then on some of them, we haven't had as good of luck classifying them. Landon, are my numbers about right on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're kind of bang on, and sort of just for context, what we consider roughly stable would be about 25 lambs per 100 ewes, and so that would basically maintain the population. And yeah, we're sort of in the ballpark of anywhere from 26 to 35. So we're sitting pretty okay for late winter recruitment, that is.
And that's assuming that we've got decent adult female survival, which it has actually been sort of at that. We hope to see sort of 85+% annual adult female survival, which is pretty close to what we've been getting.
Yeah, so that was my next step. So next question is, you talked about 2020, the survey that was done there. You noticed the significant declines. Fast forward, this project comes on the radar. Have you guys done recruitment surveys since then? Obviously, you've done some capture work to get the collars out there, but has there been any? Obviously, you're talking about over winter survival. Is that just based on the collared animals, or did you guys do surveys on top of that outside of it?
So what we end up doing is every June we try and get out kind of in June or early July. Once you've got kind of these big groups of ewes with their lambs, and we go out and locate all of our collared ewes. And ideally what you're looking for is, does that collared ewe have a lamb at heel with her? The reality is you get there and there's a swarm of 40 ewes and lambs and yearlings, and everyone's all mixed together, and there's 3 collars in there. And so we actually end up getting a better sample size because we basically take the composition of that entire group. And now instead of saying, okay, of the 22 collared ewes we've got out there, here's how many lambs we have. Instead, we're like, okay, well, we went out and we counted 150 sheep. And here's how many ewes, here's how many lambs. And sometimes we can tease apart if there's only a couple of them, whether a specific collared ewe has a lamb with her. Often it's just kind of this swarm of ewes and lambs that gives us a pretty good sense of where we're sitting for our recruitment levels. generally for those kind of demographic composition surveys, you like to see at least sort of 100 females in order to get a really good sample size on what those calf ratios or lamb ratios are looking like. So I've actually been very happy with the quality of the data that we've gotten to get those results. And then we also pull together when we are doing the body condition captures. So we do them in early winter, sort of December, January, to get a sense of that body condition going into winter. And then again in late March, that's sort of their bottomed out kind of late winter, worst possible condition. And we'll also be recording whether any of our collared ewes have lambs with them that have survived through to early winter and then all the way through to late winter, because you can have different kind of mortality pressures and survival rates between those different time periods as well. Awesome. Landon, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I mean, that was pretty spot on. Just circling back to the 2020 population estimate or assessment there, I think we had pretty good weather, pretty good snow conditions. So, I think our confidence in what we got in the specific range, just the Finley-Russell range, was pretty good. Through our work, we're starting to get a better understanding of where sheep are in the rest of the general area. But as far as that survey went, I think, for that specific range, we did a pretty good job.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the project itself now. With regards to Finley-Russell, what are some of the intended outcomes? So you talked about the two-part, the population, and then also the nutrition, which the bulk of your studies on that. Talk about what do you guys see coming out of that study, and then what are some possible management actions? And I know that's cart before the horse because you don't even have the outcomes yet. You can't project what those, but what are some possible outcomes that could come from this study?
I think one of the great things, and you're spot on there, Kyle, with the cart before the horse thing. Often we really want to just get management actions going on the land base. But as Landon's kind of alluded to, if we don't even know whether it's summer range or winter range that's limiting, or if we want to put in some enhancement for habitat and it's under snow when the sheep need it, a lot of these are, very logistically difficult, expensive kind of operations. We really want to target them for when they're going to have the best outcomes for sheep. And so we really are kind of at the point with this project of let's get the science that's going to inform science-based management. But yeah, maybe Landon, do you want to talk about some of the potential kind of avenues that the nutrition stuff could inform that people have been using in kind of other jurisdictions, or that we've heard sort of batted around as like, this would be an exciting thing to do, that we kind of say, okay, but back up, let's see if it would even potentially work for our sheep.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if we can kind of establish, which season is the most important, that's going to make us significantly more efficient with any habitat enhancement in the future, given a similar system. Not all stone sheep across the different regions are in similar systems as we have in the Finley-Russell, but it kind of helps establish, that baseline of, what could be going on, what should be considered to be the most efficient. And then, figuring out these relationships between fat and, these different metrics like, pregnancy, lamb at heel status, and survival, lamb survival, those things moving forward. We can figure out those relationships and know that fat influences those. If we say we, survey a different area that has really poor recruitment or really poor lamb survival or ewe survival, we know that if we boost fat, regardless of what's going on, we can probably help that population out. Now, the way to do that is, typically is prescribed burning, but, there's a lot of new ideas being tossed out, like Morgan said, such as like fertilizer treatments or, other metrics or other means like manual brushing or something to open up areas that sheep will want to use then if they're opened up, because they have better sightability, and, that new light will improve growth or improve access to new growth. There's a lot of these ideas, coming out down the pipe that we want to develop in the right way. But for our project, we don't want to introduce any of those variables just yet because we're still trying to establish these baselines. But it would be really interesting, in the future to see some of these pre and post responses in body fat to different treatments. But we still got to establish the baselines first. And make sure that we know what we're doing or what we're getting into before we try to mess with anything else, I guess.
And I mean, it's one of those things too, where stone sheep are one of those ones where it's like, oh yeah, we always forget about the kind of disease side because we don't have disease issues right now, but it's one that we do try to keep kind of front and center, because if we get disease issues into some of our stone sheep populations, we are in for a rough ride for sure. So any of the management kind of outcomes of this, I think we also, even though it's not like directly related to, for example, the nutrition stuff or the survival recruitment stuff, just maintaining that messaging around keeping our thin horns disease free is just so key as well.
Okay. Yeah, very good. So Landon, just to clarify, you're doing your master's. How much time is left? And then my understanding is you're challenging your master's. You're providing a thesis, a concept, and then you're going to defend that concept based on your study. But that's not necessarily going to turn into management outcomes. That management outcomes, that's a document that will allow Morgan and her colleagues or her peers to look at that and say, okay, these are things that we can do as a government agency to support these. Is my thinking correct on that? Or talk me through what that looks like. Or are you making recommendations of next steps based on your thesis?
Yeah, no, you're kind of spot on. So yeah, I'm going to have a thesis come out of this, and hopefully a few publications as well, because this idea hasn't really been thought out or really looked into for stone sheep in BC. So that'd be kind of a new publication that at least one that we're hoping to get out of that to help inform or add some literature, some background for other projects in the area that might want to consider things like this. And then, Morgan and I will kind of together be sort of writing these recommendations moving forward. And not only for her, but also for the two First Nations, Seke and Quadacha, that are in the area. They too want to help these stone sheep the best way they can. And in particular, Quadacha First Nation wants to start, planning a 5-year wild sheep habitat enhancement plan, or stone sheep habitat enhancement plan. And so a lot of what we kind of develop is really going to inform that plan. And so we're trying to work together with them to figure out where that could best be directed.
It's one of the really great things about the project too, is because all of these different groups, so a bunch of the guides, resident hunters, Wild Sheep Society, obviously, Seke, Quadacha, the provincial government, BC Parks, because we've all been working on sort of developing this project from the outset, and everyone's a very invested partner in it, it really streamlines the conversation for any of these recommendations. They're really recommendations that we're kind of all coming up with together and discussing throughout the project, as opposed to here's a document, hand it to government and hope that something happens with it. Or here's a document, hand it to the nations and hope that they can implement it. So it's been actually really exciting having the project structured like that. And I think it's going to be a good setup for incorporating the outcomes of Landon's work into actual management.
Yeah. So that's awesome. 100%. I totally agree with everything that you're saying there, Morgan. And so on that note, let's maybe talk a bit about what from a government perspective, and not to put you on the spot, but how are our stone sheep populations doing in general? So, and for our listeners, there's not a lot of stone sheep around the world. There's a very, very segregated group, and there's been a ton of work done on bighorn sheep over the years, because they're, through multiple jurisdictions all out through the west of the U.S. and Canada and Mexico, of course. So there's been a ton of work done there. But on the stone sheep side, it's a really relatively small area and a small population. So, they maybe haven't gotten the love that bighorns have gotten historically, although there seems to be a lot more going on right now. Talk a little bit about where we at just provincially in terms of our stone sheep numbers. And you can talk about 7A if you like as well, specifically, Morgan. But do we need to do more for stone sheep? Because I think there's a will and a desire to do it, but we've been doing a lot more in the last decade, I feel. But there's probably more we can do.
Yeah, there's definitely been an increase in interest partly from the hunting community, also from a lot of the biologists kind of viewing other species besides some of the ones that we've traditionally spent a lot of our time and resources on, things like moose and caribou, and I mean, grizzly bears when we had a hunt for them. There's been a lot more work recently, it seems like, on things like stone sheep. And that's great, but it's also, I mean, their range is massive and remote and very expensive to even survey. So I think it's kind of the overall opinion is generally they're pretty stable in BC. But I would add that sort of caveat of we really don't know what's going on for a lot of specific populations. Or, I mean, just look at the Finley Russell and sort of here's a survey in 1993 and here's a survey in 2020, and we have no idea what was going on in between. And that's an area that actually did get surveyed. So there's parts of the province that haven't even been flown. It's definitely reassuring that we don't have the disease issues in any of the sampled animals. So we are actually collecting samples during like compulsory inspections of any of the harvested animals to test for things like MOBI, as well as any of these samples from captured and collared individuals. So that's a good one. But yeah, it's definitely, I think, in the back of all of our minds of as long as we can keep the diseases out of the thin horn herds, we're okay. But man, if they get in there, we're going to be in trouble. So that's kind of the hand wavy version of probably mostly fine, but also we don't even know what we don't know for a lot of the area. And then 7A, of course, is we're kind of in this snow belt middle of sheep range that isn't kind of the higher densities in the Skeena and isn't the higher densities in the Peace. And so we really haven't prioritized a lot of sheep work previously, just because things like bears, moose, and caribou have really taken up a lot of staff time and resources. But there is increasingly a shift to look at sort of broader species assemblages and biodiversity values beyond those core sort of species. And I think also the move towards a lot more kind of collaborative projects, like obviously we're doing this one largely with Wild Sheep Society and couldn't be doing it without that support. That also really helps kind of build out some of these approaches to get those knowledge gaps filled, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about what I guess our listeners, Wild Sheep Society BC members, the general population can do to support this project, these populations. Is there anything that we can do? Is there any data? Can hunters provide citizen science? Is there anything that we can do to support what you're doing in your project, Landon? Or for that matter, Morgan, anything in region that people that in 7A can do when they're out on the landscape and they maybe see disease, or they maybe see something that you might be interested in?
Yeah,
that would be a big one.
Yeah, disease reporting would be the biggest thing. You know, if you see something, say something. And, you know, in particular in our case, you know, having discovered ORF in the area, which, yeah, is a highly contagious disease, you know, it's easy to see externally. Like Morgan said, those big blisters on their mouths and things like that. You know, it's very easy to see and identify. And so reporting that whenever it's seen is really great in sheep or in goats, you know, that'll help us kind of monitor if that's spreading or where it's going, and you know if it has any serious implications for maybe young or adults or things like that. I think that would be pretty helpful. You know, hunters are pretty widespread across the province, and that's a really good observation to collect if we see it. As far as health goes, I mean, you know, there's a lot of different things you can collect. I mean, for us, you know, on animals that die or like, you know, harvested animals and things like that, we can kind of get an idea of the condition from like a marrow bone, particularly the femur, the back leg bone. You know, that's kind of helpful, but you know, not everybody wants to pack that out, and I definitely understand that. But you know, that's something that we always collect on mortalities to get an idea of an animal that's, you know, been either eaten or, you know, the meat's been taken off or something like that. That gives us a little bit of an idea of that condition of that animal, so that can kind of be helpful. But yeah, definitely not expected in all cases for sure.
Morgan, how about you?
Yeah, citizen science wise, I'm sure the listeners are probably familiar with Bill Jex has probably gone on about the natal area sheep and goat app that the province has developed. And I know he's been pulling together a bunch of the data that's come in from that. And yeah, we can't be everywhere on the land base all the time. So that's actually been a pretty useful platform for people to sort of upload their observations and identify areas that either might need some more monitoring or more protections, or that we just weren't even aware were important to sheep and goat populations. So that's actually a great outlet for people to coordinate their knowledge and get it through to some of the decision makers as well.
Now that piece of, so there's the app, and yeah, that has been really effective, and I think it's great. That data, I know Bill gets that directly. Obviously, he's going to disseminate stuff to you guys if it's applicable, but you guys don't necessarily have access to that data. It kind of goes to Bill and then gets filtered back to region, I guess. Is that correct?
Yeah, any of the sheep and goat location stuff is pretty well locked down under sort of data share and confidentiality, because of course we don't want it necessarily being misused. But yeah, so in my role, I'm signed off to have access to that information. So I am able to incorporate that into sort of any of our kind of decisions and that kind of thing. And then similarly for any of the sort of research that's related to it, we can go through data sharing agreements and have that available. Yeah.
Okay. One other thing I was going to ask about was these nasal swabs. So there's these swab kits. I know that the society has funded, I think we funded $15,000 towards these nasal swab kits that are being administered by Kylie Thacker, the provincial veterinarian for wildlife. Is that something that, if you guys had access to that information, would you like to see hunters in the Finley Russell with that, collecting that data, or is that not really necessary?
Honestly, we do the swabs when they bring them in for a CI anyway. So as long as the head's not been totally boiled, then we're good to go to grab those swabs when they come in. And unless you're shooting something, you're probably not getting close enough to shove a swab up its nose. So that's probably sufficient.
Okay. Yeah, very cool. Okay, I know, Landon, you're going to be out in the field this afternoon. I know, Morgan, you just came in out of the field. So you guys are super busy, and I really appreciate you taking the time. So we're going to wrap it up here shortly. But I guess in closing, is there anything else that either one of you want to share? Any asks from the government, from you, Landon, through your project, or any other information that we're missing, or any shout outs to any orgs or any? I know, Morgan, you gave a very good overview of the number of entities that are involved in this project and in the Finley Russells, but is there anything else that we're missing that we should share with our guests?
Is this where I get to do the be a responsible sheep hunter and know what you're shooting and don't bring me a short sheep? And for the love of God, if you just want to shoot a goat when you're up there, don't bring me a nanny. Can I do that plug now?
You absolutely can. That's right on point for sure. Yes, please do. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, great. And yeah, I'll just shout out to some of the other orgs there that, the Together for Wildlife that's supporting this project. Abbotsford Fish and Game Club that's supporting the MyTax as well, alongside the BC Wildlife Federation. And the guide and outfitters that are really helping out figure out where these sheep are. It's really helpful.
Awesome. Well, great work on both of you guys. Thank you guys so much. And Landon on the project, and Morgan, all you do for wild sheep and all, many other species as well. And then on top of it, Morgan, you do a ton of work for our horn aging and that sort of stuff. So we're both really grateful for both of you, all the great work that's being done. And Landon, I'm really excited about what the future holds for you. You're a real enthusiastic up and comer, and in our community, although you've been around for quite a while, but you're still pretty darn young. So lots of great things to come from you both. And I'm really excited about, people at the start of their career that are have so much opportunity and are so involved, and that they're really involved in the sheep file. Obviously, we're biased there. I know there's a lot of species that need their love out there, and so when we get people in the sheep world, we're grateful. So thank you both. Landon, anywhere if anyone's interested in your work, I know we post your updates and your it'll be in our magazine. This last one you did, and it's on our website. But anywhere else people can go for any information about what you're doing.
There's not a lot of great places. The Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation posted an article about the Together for Wildlife Scholarship. So there's a little bit of a write-up about my research there. And then, that magazine article I wrote as well is available. And then I think there might be a little bit of information on the UBCO Adam Ford Wire Lab website. People can go there if they want to try to get in touch with me or learn a little bit about what I'm doing there. But otherwise, I'm an open book. I'm keen to hear other people's stories or observations about stone sheep, particularly up in that area. It's a pretty low density area, so I'm always keen to hear about it. Otherwise.
Awesome.
Landon's going to keep on churning out some of those updates for us on sort of a regular basis, so everyone can just kind of keep their eyes out. And Kyle, you can keep sending them to all your people.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys both so much. Appreciate all you do. And are you guys going to be down at Sheep Week? You're going to be in Reno?
I have too many things to catch this winter to make it down.
Come on, you got to come. You got to go.
Awesome. I'm hoping to at least be in Penticton for that, but at least.
Okay. Awesome. That sounds great. Well, keep us posted on that. And then Morgan, do you think you can make it down to Penticton? You too busy as well for that?
I'm probably swamped, but keep me in the loop and we'll see. The schedule is constantly shifting, so who knows?
Fair.
Otherwise,
Fair. Okay.
Landon can wear a long blonde wig and a toque and basically pretend he's me.
No, it's not the same. It's not the same.
It's not the
same. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you both so much. Appreciate it and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Yeah, you too, Kyle.
Yeah. Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks.